Poštovani gledalci, dobro večer. Još jedno izdanje emisije U centar iz hotela Podgorica. Naš večerašnji gost je admiral Džejmsom Stavridis, glavnokomandujući NATO snaga za Evropu. Mr. Stavridis, good evening and welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again.
It's my pleasure to talk to you again. We already met in Budva 3 years ago when you also have an official visit to Montenegro.
I did.
The same first question like 3 years ago.
Okay.
How do you estimate the current situation in the region and what can you tell us about the progress regarding NATO accession with a special concern on Montenegro? Does anything change in the meantime?
Yes, I think a great deal has changed in the region, and I think it is very positive change by and large. For example, when we sat down 3 years ago, we had 15,000 NATO troops in Kosovo. Because the situation there has continued to improve, we have reduced that number to only 5,000 today. Now, there are still challenges in Kosovo, of course, which we are aware of, but we are in dialogue, and we see a safe and secure environment in Kosovo. We see increasing levels of dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo. So I think there's been improvement there. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, we see a nation that has begun what we call a membership action plan provisionally toward membership in NATO, and has recently worked very hard to resolve some problems with defense property. We see real progress here in Montenegro.
Yeah, let's see what's happening with Montenegro.
I will, of course. And in Montenegro, we see strong progress toward NATO membership. We see a military that is more professional. We see a defense budget that has been rising a little bit, and that is a good thing. We see a new Minister of Defense who just took over today, very competent and qualified. We see a very experienced Chief of Defense, Vice Admiral Sramadic, who has now been in place for 3 years. So we see lots of progress, and I would also add, in those 3 years, we have seen Montenegrin troops deploy to Afghanistan, where they have done an exceptionally good job working in peacekeeping operations with NATO and non-NATO members. So I think there's been a lot of progress. I think Montenegro is closer today to NATO membership, and I hope that day comes soon when Montenegro is a full member of NATO.
We will speak about that day later. So what is your opinion regarding the enlargement of the alliance? And should we expect that this issue could be discussed at the forthcoming summit in Chicago?
I think the summit in Chicago will not be an enlargement summit, which is what NATO, the terminology NATO uses when we're going to actually invite new members. I think, however, that the spirit of the open membership to NATO, the treaty provisions that allow any nation that meets the NATO standards, is a democracy, and is accepted by all the nations, I think that will be discussed, and I think Montenegro's voice will be heard in that process.
Maybe real question is, what can we expect for Montenegro at this summit? Something precisely, or just the future guidelines?
Well, you know, that's a political decision that will be made by the Secretary General. Really, that's in the political sphere. What I can say from a military perspective is that the military of Montenegro is doing a terrific job and is moving forward very capably toward membership.
Is NATO still fully committed to supporting Montenegrin way towards Euro-Atlantic family, or there are some discrepancies in its policy regarding this issue?
I don't think there are discrepancies. I think there has been steady progress for Montenegro, and engagement in the Euro-Atlantic community for this nation is very important, and I believe it will continue to grow in time.
These speculations we heard from the opposition member of parliament. He informed Montenegrin society about NATO shifting its policy after his visit to Brussels. So do you have any comments regarding this?
I am unfamiliar with the member of parliament you mentioned. What I know in the military dimension is that I continue to see progress toward membership.
Our contribution for ISAF mission in Afghanistan. How do you see the role of Montenegrin soldiers in Afghanistan?
I see them as very capable, operating both in the north near Mazar-e Sharif, but more recently very effective in training. And they are involved in the Kabul area. And you know, training is the most important thing we are doing in Afghanistan, because that is how we will transition and turn over security in Afghanistan to the Afghan people. That will happen by the end of 2014. Montenegrins are doing wonderful work helping train Afghan security forces in Kabul.
Last accident in Afghanistan. Will the Afghanistan massacre accelerate the time frame for withdrawing international troops?
No, I do not think so. I think the event that occurred in Kandahar here a couple of days ago, in which tragically a group of Afghans were killed, I do not think that event will have any effect on our timeline. We will continue to have a steady strategy to turn over Afghan leadership in the security dimension to the Afghan security forces. Today, 50% of Afghanistan is under Afghan security lead. By this fall, that will be 70%. By the end of 2014, it will be 100%. That plan continues. The event you are describing, tragic, but will not have impact on our strategy.
What is your opinion about that accident?
I am awaiting the results of the investigation. All I can say is that any time civilians are killed, it is tragic. I think it is worth noting in Afghanistan that the United Nations studies all of these incidents, and the most recent United Nations report for 2011 showed that 80% of the civilian casualties in Afghanistan were caused by the Taliban. 20% were caused by the coalition, by ISAF and NATO. We are working very hard to reduce civilian casualties as low as we can possibly make them. I wish the Taliban were working as hard to reduce civilian casualties.
So you plan to stay in Afghanistan?
Until 2014. At the end of 2014, we will complete turnover to the Afghan security forces. After 2014, I would anticipate a small number of troops from the alliance remaining to do training, some intelligence work, maintenance, some special forces. But I believe that overall, the vast majority of all of our troops will come home by the end of 2014.
What are the advantages and disadvantages for a small country and small society like we are?
In terms of joining the NATO alliance?
Yes.
I think the advantages are very clear. You get the gold standard of security. When you are a member of NATO, if you are ever attacked by anyone, that is the same as an attack on all the nations. That is, Article 5 of the NATO treaty says an attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. I think there is an economic benefit to joining the NATO alliance in that I believe business is more likely to come and invest in a nation that has met the standards and has joined NATO. Thirdly, I think it is very helpful in gaining accession to the European Union, which again has significant economic benefits. And fourth and finally, it helps your military afford and be involved in high-end, high-technology activities, everything from missile defense to airborne early warning, that a small nation could not afford on its own, but it could be part of pooling and sharing with a larger group. Those would be the advantages. Frankly, I can't think of any disadvantage to joining NATO.
You want to say, I think so, that the NATO now is not strictly a military organization?
NATO is an organization that is focused on security. Now, security is a very broad term in today's 21st century, so NATO is involved in humanitarian operations. We went to the assistance of Pakistan during flooding, during earthquakes. NATO nations came and helped here in Montenegro most recently during the terrible natural disasters in the snow region here. So NATO is involved in humanitarian operations. We are involved in the comprehensive approach, which seeks to create zones of security as we do in a place like Kosovo. We're involved in anti-piracy operations. we seek to ensure that our members have democratic values and live up to the standards of the treaty. So I would say it's not just a military organization, but it is a security organization in the broad sense of that term.
Our people are pretty divided when it comes to NATO integration. What are the concrete benefits of membership in NATO, and why do you think it would be useful for our country?
As I said a moment ago, I think the concrete benefits are
we need
the
concrete
security
message for our citizens.
I would say the
from you, like Supreme Commander.
I appreciate that, and I'll say it again. I think that being part of this alliance protects your nation because it allows you access to high technology, information, intelligence, training, logistics. You become part of an organization that is the gold standard of security. And that membership also enhances the opportunity for Montenegro to join the European Union, to be part of the economic benefits, and I would argue it also encourages outside investors to come here because they know the environment is secure in Montenegro. I think those are very concrete benefits.
What is the essential difference today between NATO and EU?
Well, I think the biggest and most obvious one is that the European Union is centered only here in Europe, whereas NATO has a transatlantic connection. So you bring the umbrella, the protective capability of the United States and Canada, the North American partners, and add it to the very powerful capability of the European partners. So I would argue NATO, from a security dimension, provides the broadest possible capability. Obviously, the European Union, centered here in Europe, has very good capability, and I think particularly in the economic dimension has a great deal to offer in terms of free trade zone and movement of workers and so forth. So two different organizations. I would argue that a European nation would want to join both of them. And obviously many do, because 26 of the NATO members are also members of the European Union.
What is the role of the Balkan as a natural link between East and West? What is the place of Montenegro within this region?
Well, first of all, the thing that I always think of when I think of Montenegro are two things. One is that it has a long history of independence, and the second is that Montenegro manages to get along well with all of its neighbors. That's a very good quality in a nation. And so I think Montenegro, which is a multi-ethnic society, is a very good example here in the Balkans of how people can get along in a society even if they are from different religions or ethnic backgrounds. So that is the role of Montenegro. Now, in terms of the Balkans broadly, I think that the Balkans really are a vital part of Europe. They have great human capital. Obviously, they are emerging from a 10-year period of real distress in the 1990s. And when I look at the progress here in the Balkans since the last 10 years, it's incredibly impressive. And I look at the Balkans as an area of high potential for tourism, for manufacturing, for human capital, for education, for great wines. All these things come together in the Balkans, and they are a vital part of Europe that must be integrated fully into not just Europe, but the Euro-Atlantic community, in my view.
In that sense, what do you think are our main potentials when we are talking about NATO and EU integration?
I think Montenegro brings, first and foremost, human capital. Smart people, highly trained, also those who have operated...
But small population.
Small population, but a small population can contribute in a big way. And we see that today in Afghanistan, for example. And so also you have a very important position here on the Adriatic. This is a coastline that is important. It is a coastline that sits between two NATO members. It would be very good to fill in that coastline. And then thirdly, stability in Montenegro helps create stability in the Balkans. Stability in the Balkans is good for Europe. Stability in Europe is good for the world and the transatlantic community. So I think Montenegro is a small nation, but it is a nation with a great heart and a great deal to provide in terms of security in this alliance.
If Montenegro joins NATO, would it mean the opening NATO military and marine bases in our country?
No.
What is your opinion?
No, I do not foresee any additional bases. In fact, NATO is in the process of closing bases, not opening bases. This year, NATO will close down up from our 11 current major commands and bases. We're going to close down to only 6. We are reducing our command structure from 13,000 personnel to only 8,800. So I think it is highly unlikely, and I would not expect to see any bases in Montenegro.
I know that you don't have enough time. I will ask you just a few short questions. If Montenegro becomes a member of NATO, would it be the target for terrorist threats or attacks?
There is no history of nations joining NATO and then becoming more targets of terrorism. So I think that is very unlikely.
Are you satisfied with the cooperation with our country? You mentioned before that you are, but we are very interested for the next summit in Chicago. And in that sense, we are interested for concrete results.
I am extremely pleased with the military activity that I see here, and that's my job, is to look at the military-to-military cooperation, which is excellent here between Montenegro and the NATO alliance. I will also say, as a serving senior officer of the United States of America, that the bilateral cooperation between the United States and Montenegro, military-to-military, is also excellent. So I think there is great progress toward NATO membership. I think the relationships are all very strong. Obviously, in the end, these are political decisions, but I assure you from a military perspective, Montenegro is doing a terrific job preparing itself for NATO membership.
What is your expectation when Montenegro could become a member of NATO?
I think I'd just say soon, very soon.
Okay, thank you for this conversation.
Much. Great to see you again, and thank you so much. And I must say I had an excellent lunch today, and we tried 5 different wines from Montenegro, and the wine is spectacular here.
After astonishing history, we got good wines. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Poštovani gledalci, eto, bio je to admiral Džejmsom Stavridis. Nadam se da ste imali priliku da čujete neke novije informacije kad je NATO integracija u pitanju i da ste u tom smislu zadovoljili svoja iščekivanja i svoju znatiželju. Hvala vam na pažnji i želim vam laku noć.